Hey, everybody. Good evening. It's nice to be with you again. My name is Dr. Shane Stedman with Integrated Health, and we're doing our monthly webinar. And this one is titled Blood Sugar and the Circadian Rhythm. So we're thinking about, we've been back up a little bit, but we've been talking about blood sugar a lot and how it impacts the body. And this month we've written articles on it and done some really cool things out there. But I thought that talking about the blood sugar and circadian rhythm would be kind of a really good tie together, because when we talk about those two individual topics, we can dive deep into certain conditions like sleep, which we'll talk about, and energy, and things like that. So I wanted to kind of bring this topic and combine those two worlds together, because we also talk about it all the time in the office. So this is, if we're talking about it often inside the office, and it's got to be a topic out there that other people are usually asking questions about, and things like that. So we will definitely go through all of that. And as usual, I'll watch the chat. And if you guys have questions, definitely put it into the chat, and we'll have this recorded, and you can go back and listen to it again another time if you've missed a couple things I said, or if you want to hear something again, or share it with a friend. That's always a good thing as well. So I will go through this, and so we'll probably do about half hour or 40 minutes at the most. So we'll try to shorten to the point, because everybody's got a lot of things to do these days. So we'll definitely kind of get the ball rolling. So there we go. All right. So circadian rhythm, I'm going to start off with that. So what is it? And kind of talk about physiology a little bit. And in our circadian rhythm, a lot of people understand this, right? It's our sleep and wake rhythm. And everybody should have a certain time that they go to sleep. And there's certain things that happen when you're sleeping, and then you have your day rhythm. And so we should be tired at night, and we should be awake during the day. And you say that simply, or I say that simply. However, you find people who are awake all night long and they sleep during the day. I've had patients who go to bed at 2 or 3 in the morning, and they wake up at 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And that is their rhythm. And it's not a healthy rhythm, but interestingly enough, it's their rhythm. And sometimes you find people that actually fall into a good rhythm. It's just, it needs to be shifted down. But these rhythms also get messed up, and this is why we got to talk about it, is that you see different things like night shift workers. They have really abnormal circadian rhythms. Your flight attendants have abnormal circadian rhythms, and people who work late or bar shifts and things like that. So when you start looking at the population of, if we say nurses, healthcare, flight attendants, night shift workers, crews that work at night, bartenders, even when I worked in a restaurant, I remember all the circadian rhythms were just off, because when you work in a restaurant, you tend to work until 10, 11 o'clock. And sometimes by the time you got home, it took you another half hour to an hour just to like unwind, from that shift. And so you end up going to bed at midnight. So most of the people that I knew that were in the restaurant industry usually were night owls. So then during college, I remember we had to make sure that we had classes that started at 10 or 11, because you were probably not making those 8 o'clock classes. So the circadian rhythm is a big deal, and it really impacts health. I mean, so much so that we're even talking about there's actually conditions associated with night shift workers. And so they're really starting to do more research on this and find out how does it impact their health. So we know the circadian rhythm is important, and it's our sleep-wake cycle. So physiologically, probably one of the biggest things that I'm going to connect with the circadian rhythm, that some of the terms I'll be using interchangeably will be cortisol and adrenals. And the adrenal system is right. You have your kidneys, right on top of your kidneys, you have two glands. And so they call it adrenals. To make it really simple, your kidneys are renal glands, and then adrenals, that's your adrenals. AD means on top of or above. So it's usually your glands that sit on top of your kidneys. And so what they do is they help to support many, many different functions, such as your glucose. Your aldosterone system is affected by that. Your mineralocorticoid system, which is sodium, potassium. So these systems play a big role into like energy and sleep and blood pressure, some of your heart rate, sodium, potassium levels, like your electrolyte system. Your adrenals have a really big role into that. So when we talk about circadian rhythm, and I got a cool map I'll show you later, but we look and say, hey, what should happen? And what should happen physiologically is that your cortisol or your circadian rhythm is high at night. And so that nighttime cortisol, the morning time cortisol when you wake up should be the highest. And then as the day goes on, it slowly starts to decrease until you reach that bedtime. And when it's your bedtime, then that rhythm will start to, slowly kind of pick back up again. And we'll talk about why. And it starts all over with being super high when you wake up. And that should be your circadian rhythm. So we say, well, what are some of the symptoms of abnormal circadian rhythms? Fatigue. So if somebody's waking up and they're just dragging, trying to get going, it might take them until 10, 11 o'clock and 10 cups of coffee and other things. That's not a good circadian rhythm. And over the years, I've seen some really fascinating circadian rhythms that have been inverse. Instead of being high in the morning and low at night, they're now low in the morning and high at night. I've seen people who had flat circadian rhythms where they're just exhausted all day long. Seen people who have really high, like kind of cortisol circadian rhythms, and they're usually like just super stressed all the time. So circadian rhythms are a really, really important feature that is good to talk about. But again, I'm going to interject it with, probably the term adrenals and cortisol, because all these pieces really kind of help with the circadian rhythm. So then we talk about blood sugar. So blood sugar is obviously an important piece. We get it from, carbs and fruit and even vegetables. I think this is probably the other big topic that we talk about a lot in the office, because you see a lot of abnormal blood sugar. So there's kind of maybe three big terms to talk about. We have low blood sugar, which is hypoglycemic. And then we have high blood sugar, which is hyperglycemic, or formerly known, or most known as insulin resistance or diabetes. Now, I get asked this question all the time in the office. When we say you have low blood sugar, people go, oh, does that mean I'm going into diabetes? And it's like, no. Low blood sugar is on one end of the spectrum and diabetes is on the other. And I know some people might watch this and go, what? It's amazing how many times I get asked that question. So we definitely talk about the two very often, and we see the two very, very often. Now, the third blood sugar issue that we talk about is called dysglycemia. Now, hypo means low. Obviously, hyper means high and too much. And then dys means abnormal. See, DYS is abnormal, just like dysfunction is abnormal function. So we have dysglycemia, or abnormal glycemic or blood sugar. And so, but the reason why I bring up the dysglycemia piece is because that is just as detrimental to health as it is hyper or hypo. And so that's something that I don't think gets talked about very often. And you actually see a lot of dysglycemia when you have these abnormal circadian rhythms. So kind of talk about kind of your different symptoms, because I think that's important to know. Because a lot of times, patients will run blood work and they go, oh, you're totally fine. And they go, well, why? Why do I crash? Why do I get headaches? Why do I have sleep issues? Why do I have this? And sometimes it's actually more of a form of dysglycemia and not necessarily too low or too high. And there's even hormonal impacts that the dysglycemia can have. So for example, in females, one of the most common symptoms or most common causes of polycystic ovarian syndrome is actually dysglycemia. So dysglycemia in females will actually increase testosterone levels, and the testosterone will then cause a production of cyst. So which is actually fascinating, because if you look at probably right now, the number one medication that I see being prescribed for PCOS is metformin, which is a diabetic medication. So that just kind of tells you how much blood sugar, insulin resistance, that whole world actually plays a role into hormones. So to kind of just, I guess, keep bringing it back around so we don't go off on too big of a tangent, but dysglycemia it's something that really doesn't get discussed in healthcare all that much. Patients don't really understand too much about it. So bringing it to the table, I think, is important. So I'll be talking about dysglycemia off and on as well. Now, low blood sugar symptoms, you tend to see uh, more things like jittery, shaky, irritable, hangry, um, migraines, headache, and also people that have low blood sugar, they tend to feel better when they eat. So between meals, they tend to get those low blood sugar symptoms of jittery, shaky, irritable, lightheaded, moody, all those things like that. Now, symptoms of high blood sugar, it's interesting because there could be some similarities, but they're definitely different. And I'll kind of lay out the differences. But symptoms of high, we tend to see like the diabetes, the insulin resistance. So we tend to see things like weight gain, increase like hip to waist ratio. One of the biggest things that you see in diabetics actually is depression. And that's because of the impact of your blood sugar and insulin, and then your neurotransmitters or your amino acids that create neurotransmitters. So it's kind of interesting that people with low blood sugar tend to have anxiety, where high blood sugar patients tend to have more depression, just because of how the blood sugar mechanisms interact with neurotransmitters. So you start kind of like getting an idea as patients give you symptoms, so they go, I'm always shaky and I'm just anxious all the time. And, and I get headaches, and you're like, oh, that sounds like low blood sugar. So sometimes it can be that simple. And then dysglycemia, sometimes they just talk about how they're all over the place. Sometimes they get a headache and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they feel shaky and sometimes they don't. And it's just all over the place. And a lot of times with patients, we'll talk about the roller coasters, where they just feel like they're on a roller coaster all day long. And that tends to be more of your like dysglycemia. And then finally, when we look at sleep, so it's kind of simple, but it is mostly this simple, but obviously it can get intricate with different people. But traditionally, if you tend to see people who cannot stay asleep, that can be a factor of low blood sugar. People that have a hard time going to sleep tend to have high blood sugar. And so we kind of see with like a lot of diabetics, they tend to be night owls, where they're just kind of flipping through channels, just kind of waiting for their sugars and cortisol and everything to go down. Whereas people with low blood sugar, they can go to bed and, within 10 minutes usually, but then they wake up at 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock. And sometimes they wake up with headaches, and sometimes they wake up with anxiety. And you tend to see more of that low blood sugar symptom with people that have a difficulty staying asleep. Now, what's kind of fascinating about the two systems is a lot of times blood sugar and adrenals, they tend to kind of go together. Or we can say blood sugar and cortisol. So patients that tend to have high blood sugar also have high cortisol. And patients that have low blood sugar tend to have low cortisol. And so we tend to see those two matches, where if somebody's circadian rhythm is flatlined, then we tend to see that those patients also have low blood sugar symptoms, or they have low blood sugar on blood work. And people who have high cortisol or high circadian rhythm, like throughout the entire day, they tend to be more of the insulin resistance, maybe pre-diabetic, diabetic patients, or maybe they're trending in that direction. So you kind of see that adrenals and blood sugar, they tend to kind of go hand in hand very often on lab testing, and it tends to match clinically. So it kind of makes it sometimes a little bit easy for us when we're trying to diagnose different patients. So we can have circadian variations in blood sugar. So let's talk about how they interact. So usually, like I said, so you have adrenals or cortisol or that circadian rhythm, it tends to be higher in the morning. And so then we look at blood sugar in the morning, and it tends to be a little bit more up there, but that's why it's always a good chance to kind of check your blood sugar first thing in the morning, because you've had that whole fasting period, and 12 hours of fasting is a good time to check blood sugar. But we kind of look at, how does that affect it? So a lot of times, I'll back up. So I've ran a lot of adrenal panels, and the adrenal panels I love running are saliva test. And so what you do is you spit into a tube. There's 4 tubes. So you do first thing in the morning, lunchtime, usually mid-afternoon to close to dinner, and then late at night. So we can actually kind of map out that circadian rhythm. And there are times when you see somebody that maybe wakes up and they have good circadian rhythms, and then it goes from like high to very low, and then it crashes throughout the day. And sometimes you'll see that with blood sugar, where people wake up and they're like, oh, I got energy, I feel great, let's tackle the day. And then by 10 o'clock, it's like somebody just pulled the plug out, everything crashed. and they're really struggling to get through. And they'll say, hey, everything started mid-morning. So this is kind of how you see that interaction between the cortisol, the circadian rhythm, and blood sugar, is that if that system crashes, it makes it really hard to regulate or maintain blood sugar. So in between your like meal times or feeding times, that's when your adrenals tend to kind of come in and say, hey, I got you. And so you can kind of go do what you need. I can pull some glucose out of storage if I need to. We'll touch on that here in a second, but you have storages of glucose, so you can tap into that and say, hey, I got you, don't worry about it. But when you have patients that have, low adrenals or low cortisol, and that circadian rhythm kind of drops on them, that's when you see their fatigue drop, their fatigue gets worse, their energy goes down, their brain fog goes up, and they just tend to crash. And you'll see that like mid-morning. And then probably the most classic one is mid-afternoon. And so usually I kind of chuckle, because if you look at all the commercials that are around 2 to 4, they're all usually centered around sugar. So it's certain candy bars, it's certain drinks, certain fast food drinks, certain coffee stores that promote their drinks, but they're all the sugary drinks, because that's when you tend to see like the adrenals kind of dip. They dip in the afternoon for a lot of people, and then they'll come back up. But that little dip is that mid-afternoon sluggishness that people get. And so that kind of tells you, and you'll see this too when you're running saliva tests, is that you'll see it go kind of normal, like kind of drop down a little bit, because it should, and then all of a sudden they get this like drop off, and they'll come back up for the afternoon or the evening time. So just that variation in the circadian rhythm can really change, the blood sugar stability during that time. And people say, oh, I get a headache in the mid-afternoon. I have to take a nap in the mid-afternoon. I crash in the mid-afternoon. I have to go get, a dessert or a coffee or a sugary drink or an energy drink. Like they're usually getting something, trying to like bring that system back up to some kind of level of stability just to get through the rest of their day. So that's how these, like a lot of the times, these two systems are pretty interchanged. Now, when we get to the nighttime, that's where this whole circadian rhythm definitely comes into play, because you'll see that some people, they should, in the nighttime, you start off low when you go to bed. And then what happens is that circadian rhythm starts to come up, and it's as a response to your blood sugar dropping. So as your blood sugar decreases throughout the night, then your cortisol rhythm or your adrenals, they start to come up. And that's a good thing, because that's how you're able to pull storage of glucose out. So again, your adrenals say, hey, I want you to have a great night of sleep. I'm going to take care of you. Let me do my job. And so my job is, as the blood sugar is decreasing, that the adrenals or the cortisol levels start to elevate. And that's why when you wake up in the morning, that's when your cortisol is the highest. And that's when that circadian rhythm tends to be the highest. So with all that being said, is that if the blood sugar is dropping at night like it should, and that adrenal system or that circadian rhythm isn't coming up, then what happens is your brain then says, hey, what's going on? And I'm going to interject, and I'm going to make the calls. And usually that involves some kind of stress response. And that's when you tend to see people wake up in the middle of the night. And then when patients wake up, they tend to say things like, yeah, I woke up and my mind was racing. I woke up in a sweat. I woke up hungry. I woke up with a headache. So you kind of have these different symptoms, because your brain says, hey, there's something not right. And so I'm going to create a stress response. And for some people, they can go back to bed in 20 minutes. Other people, maybe it takes an hour or two, just because you created that stress response. And now you have to wait for that stress response to settle back down so you can go to sleep. So it's a really fascinating thing. And I love talking about that, because it starts to make a little bit of sense of some of the insomnias that are out there. And just to really tell people that some of these insomnias, you can play around with blood sugar and or adrenal supplements, and you might find that this is the cause, where you're taking all these different meds and trying this and trying that, even melatonin, which I'll show you a graph on that. But, melatonin and cortisol are inversely related. So people take melatonin and try to go sleep. And if we can kind of figure out the cause, or we can work on that cause, then that's when I think people can do much better and get over some of these things. So this is probably one of my favorite graphs. So it looks at the cortisol and the melatonin rhythms. So this is what I was kind of explaining is that if you to the left side of the graph, you have cortisol that should be high at night or high in the morning. So it's high in the morning and melatonin is lowest, right? So it makes sense that cortisol or your circadian rhythm would start to go from high to low, just as that melatonin is going from low to high. And so when people have to take melatonin to go to sleep, that might be a clue that your cortisol levels are too high. Because if cortisol levels are high at night, then where's melatonin? It's probably too low. And so sometimes that's a clue to us that was like, okay, you have to take melatonin. So what is your circadian rhythm like? And then you can see that the graph goes up. So throughout the nighttime, when your blood sugar is dipping, then your cortisol, your circadian rhythm starts to go back up again, usually around 8 a.m. or so. So cortisol and melatonin are decreased, and thank goodness. But again, if your cortisol dips, does your melatonin start to climb up again? And those are some really fascinating rhythms, but a lot of people don't think about a melatonin rhythm. And that's why I kind of like this graph, because I think it really starts to make sense of some of these like sleep-wake cycles that we have in our circadian rhythm. So I guess maybe before I jump off of this, then we can look at cortisol too, blood sugar, because if the cortisol again is too high across if you look at the graph and everything was too high, then you tend to see that blood sugar also can be too high. If that circadian rhythm is doing a roller coaster, you tend to see that blood sugar will also kind of follow that roller coaster response. If cortisol or the circadian rhythm dips, then you see your blood sugar dip. So I really find that kind of that cortisol and blood sugar, they tend to kind of fall in line with each other, while that melatonin is inversely related. And I think this is where people who have the CGMs or a continuous glucose monitor, that's where these people get to see some really cool stuff, because you can kind of watch. So if you have a symptom, then you can take your phone and you scan the little disc on your arm and you find out, okay, what is my blood sugar right now? And so you can almost kind of use your blood sugar and kind of track it and see, like, what's it doing throughout the day? Do I have low glucose? Do I have dysglycemia, or am I just too high all day? And then you can see what happens with meals. So we'll kind of talk about timing in a second, but you can also use that when it comes to meals. Now, continuous glucose monitors, you can usually get insurance to pay for them, mostly for diabetics. But there's a company called Freestyle Libre. And so they actually will give a cash pay rate to patients, which is really nice. So you can get a CGM for like 2 weeks. And then you're done. Super simple. And 2 weeks is about all you need, because you just need to kind of see, like, what is my rhythm? What happens when I eat certain foods? If I wake up in the middle of the night, what does my blood sugar look like? If I'm sitting here at midnight with tons of energy, what does my blood sugar looks like? If I wake up in the morning and I can't function and I just am so groggy, what does my blood sugar look like? So it's kind of a cool window into seeing if blood sugar and your symptoms are interrelated. And so one thing I wanted to chat about was there's actually a concept called a cortisol awakening response. And this is kind of cool. Actually, I could have pulled a graph, I forgot. But when you look at that circadian rhythm, if we kind of go back at the very beginning of the circadian rhythm, there's actually this little bump. And it lasts for like 20 minutes right when you wake up. And a lot of the research states that cortisol awakening response can really dictate kind of how the rhythm is, how your circadian rhythm goes. So there are things that people can do in that first 20 minutes to actually kind of reset that cortisol awakening response. So a mentor of mine, he always talked about how do you jumpstart the car in the morning. So that car was your cortisol awakening response. So there are some really cool things that actually can be done, where you can use they call like HIIT training, which are, they're not like full-on trainings, but you can get quite a bit of, they're pretty powerful too. But you can look up like HIT or HITT. So you can do like HIIT training in that 20-minute window, right when you wake up. You can actually do some adrenal supplements like ashwagandha or licorice or or things like that, where you can kind of like just utilize some exercise and adrenals to kind of like jumpstart that car, so to speak, and that'll help to set that rhythm for the day. So it's actually one way that we can kind of work on the circadian rhythm is doing things first thing in the morning. But you do have this morning rise in blood sugar, and it's due to that cortisol awakening response. So it's kind of a cool concept that not a lot of people actually talk about. So influence on meals and blood sugar. So we know that timing is definitely a big deal. And there's so many different theories, thoughts, philosophies, and guidelines out there. And so this is kind of not one of those topics. That's a whole nother topic to get into timing. But I know Dr. Maynard, if you go to our YouTube site, Dr. Maynard actually did a whole talk on like doing fasting, intermittent fasting, and fasting mimicking types of diets. So they can be beneficial, but there's kind of a time and a place for those. So timing is actually could be really important for a lot of people, because if we look at timing, right, something like snacking in the evening can really bump your blood sugar so that it makes it hard to go to sleep. You have timing that if you're not eating enough throughout the day, then your blood sugar is dipping. Or if you eat too much, like you see in like in diabetics, they eat too many carbs, and what they get is they get what's called like a reactive type of hypoglycemia, where their blood sugar goes up, and then they have this insulin response, and it pushes that down into a hypo phase, and they call it a reactive hypoglycemia. And that's why you tend to see like diabetics will crave like a dessert kind of after their meals, versus people with low blood sugar, they don't really crave, they just feel better after they eat. So they always kind of say that hypoglycemics are tired before meals, diabetics are tired after meals, and that's kind of a big takeaway. So we start looking at timing. Sometimes we'll talk to patients and they will eat dinner around 5 o'clock, and then they won't eat dinner again, or they won't eat breakfast until maybe 9 o'clock. And that's great, but that's a good 16 hours without eating. And some people say, well, that's a fantastic, intermittent fasting. That is for some people, but if your blood sugar is too low, that actually can cause issues for others. And so if you go 16 hours without eating, that might be the cause of waking up with a headache, or waking up not feeling great, or waking up fatigued. So the timing can be really important. So sometimes we'll even look at people's diet in the evening and say, if you're eating at 5 and you're going to bed at midnight, that's 7 hours of not eating. And so a lot of times I might suggest, hey, let's do like 5 and 8 o'clock and do something with like protein and, things that are a little bit slower breakdown. But that timing is really important. And there's some really great apps like MyFitnessPal is an app that there's a free version to it. I know people like put on there like what time they ate, what did they eat, look at their macros, look at their calories. And sometimes that can be really important because it might shed a lot of light on the fact that you had too many carbs before you went to bed. Or some people actually eat a salad with chicken, which I would applaud that, but there's not a lot of carbs in the salad. So then you don't have a lot of carbs, you have some chicken, and then maybe you go to bed 6 hours later. So by the time you're going to bed, you're kind of on that very low end, and that might make it really tough to sleep out throughout the night. So timing can be really important, and it's kind of good to look at, but really you should be able to go from like breakfast to lunch and not feel the effects. And if you can't, then there might be something going on with your whole like adrenal system. The other influence I was kind of looking at was like glycemic index versus load. And a lot of people don't know what this concept is, but glycemic index would be the glycemic value, or how much glucose or comparative glucose is, in an apple versus, chicken versus watermelon versus rice. So they all have their individual glycemic index. And it tells you like, okay, where does that sit? In the diabetic world, they definitely use this more often, or they should, because, to have an apple would be much better than watermelon. And the reason why you look at that index being better is because an apple has more fiber. And so the fiber actually slows down that blood sugar, response. So you don't have this hit all at once, where a watermelon would like hit your blood sugar system and then you would have to react. And that's when you start seeing like the roller coasters taking place. where an apple would have a slower kind of release and delivery over time. So you don't get those massive spikes and these crashes. They actually get a much better like up and then a down. Now, if you take apple juice, the glycemic index of apple juice is actually really high. But if you look at that, it doesn't have any fiber. You're just the fruit sugar. So that would have a much higher index. Now, the best example I give for a glycemic load would be, if you had a really big salad, which has a low glycemic index, probably overall, and then you have a side of pasta, your glycemic load is going to be pretty much on the lower end. If you have a big pasta dish with a little side salad, your glycemic index is probably going to be higher because the pasta is going to have a higher index than lettuce. So you look at the overall load is going to be different based on the amount. So even if you had steak, a salad, and a little bit of, maybe a baked potato. So like, what's that load look like versus there's a restaurant I love that back in the day, I remember we used to get these big potatoes and then they would, smash two together and then they pour broccoli cheese over it. And that was one of our favorite things in college. Well, obviously there's not a lot of protein or fiber in that. So that's a pretty hefty glycemic load. And so that's how you look at like timing versus what you're eating, and then we kind of talked about fasting a little bit. Now there's a time and a place for it. Diabetics could do well with it, but sometimes that huge swing will really throw their mood off because, to go from, 300 to 170, that's a really, really big shift. So sometimes fasting is really hard, but it could be beneficial, but, each person is different. And then people who have a low blood sugar, if they're very, very hypoglycemic, fasting will sometimes just trash them. So kind of what you kind of find out in the blood sugar world is there's not one way of doing things for everybody because everybody is different based on their physiology, based on other issues. So fasting can be good, but for some people it may not be good. So we talked about sleep and blood sugar. So I kind of threw this in there. I thought it was a cute picture of a cat too. Makes me want to sleep. But so sleep and blood sugar. So I kind of already touched on this, but I wanted to make sure that I made a point of this because I think a lot of people struggle with sleep and sometimes it can be just simply blood sugar imbalances. And so I think instead of going down all these different pathways, I think the first thing you do is you look at what you put in your head. So if you're going to have, high carb, high glycemic load, glycemic index foods before you go to bed, well, you have to wait for all of that to settle back down before your body can go to sleep because you're giving your body all this fuel. And that makes it really tough. And then on the opposite side, if people don't have enough fuel, sure, they can go to bed quick because they're really tired, but then they don't have enough fuel to get through the night. So then you're having these physiological, neurological responses throughout the night, just trying to maintain function. And so sometimes we have patients that come in just like thinking they have these like grandiose ideas of this really amazing treatment plan. And I'm like, just eat. That might be your treatment plan for insomnia. And other people might stop eating so much before bed. So I think for a lot of you guys out there, that might be your simple place to kind of start. And one of the things that I've done a lot with patients is just simply say, hey, why don't we start with, if your blood sugar is too low, let's get some high quality protein, maybe some good fats and a little bit of fiber. So sometimes I've actually had patients to say, hey, can you take like an apple, like half an apple with some almond butter? This it's not a lot. It's not going to be a big hit. And if you sleep all the way through the night and your thing is the best sleep you ever had, then we know it's blood sugar. And then the same thing is like if you cut out that, afternoon or the late evening bowl of ice cream with chocolate syrup on it and you sleep much better, that probably makes sense. So I'll just say it again. Sometimes people are chasing these exotic treatment plans when they just have to change what they put in their mouth. And then I wanted to throw this in because I think when we get to brain function and, in our clinic, integrated health, we also have integrated brain centers. And basically it's this combination of functional medicine and functional neurology. And we just kind of smash the two worlds together. And so when we look at blood sugar, we also look on brain function. So to kind of give an example, right? We talked earlier that people with low blood sugar tend to have anxiety and they tend to have tremors. Well, those are both brain, an output of brain function, because if your brain is not getting enough sugar, then what happens is you can't really make GABA all that well, and GABA is a neurotransmitter that's more calming. So if you don't get enough GABA, then it's really hard to calm the brain down. So then people end up having anxiety. Same thing like in the middle of the night, if the blood sugar is too low, they usually wake up like in a panic. They wake up worrying. They wake up trying to solve world hunger. They wake up and they're trying to fix their to-do list, or they wake up thinking about what they said to somebody, because you can't get your brain to turn off because you don't have enough GABA because your blood sugar is too low. So that's just a great example of blood sugar and brain function. Whereas when we talked about diabetics kind of being more on the depressed side, then what happens is you have, a diabetic that has too much glucose. So as a result, they start like pumping the insulin, and that insulin will impact things like 5-HTP and tryptophan, which cross over the blood-brain barrier to serotonin. And so people with like diabetic patients, they tend to have serotonin imbalances, which can lead to depression, versus patients that have low blood sugar, they tend to have low GABA, which can lead to anxiety. So I kind of wanted to point that out because it impacts the brain. And very often we'll see kids that sometimes are struggling in school, and it's interesting because they're struggling in school right before lunch. And some kids, their lunch is at 10:45, and some kids, their lunch is at 12:30. Some classrooms, they allow a snack. Some classrooms, they don't allow a snack. Some kids eat breakfast at 6 or 6:30, and then they don't eat again until 12:30. And you have this high metabolism of a kid taking place. And then you start wondering, well, why are they always messing around? And, if it's English right before lunch, it's because they're hypoglycemic. So they're having a hard time functioning, concentrating, focusing. They're getting anxious. They're getting jittery. Instead of diagnosing with like ADHD, why don't we find out, are they just hypoglycemic before lunch? Or you have the other kid that has a lunch that's nothing but sugar, and then they crash afterwards. So now, they're saying, well, they're failing in this class right after lunch was because their brain's not working. They're falling asleep. Their neurotransmitters are just all over the place. And so even for kids, a lot of times we'll say, okay, what are they doing? What's their timing of their eating? What are they eating? And then make adjustments to that. And that could be simply huge in school as well, instead of trying all these different medications. So a little bit of a soapbox, but that's how much blood sugar and brain function are really, tied in together. Even when we're doing things like concussion rehab or traumatic brain injury rehab, we try to make sure that all cost blood sugar is something that's stable. And even in some cases of TBI, we actually do like ketogenic diets, or we might do a fasting. So we might do some of these things because of the implications it has on brain function could be huge. But I would tell you, with almost every single neuro case, we're always talking about blood sugar, because how do you fix a brain when the blood sugar is on a roller coaster? It makes it really hard, because I don't know if their anxiety is because their brain's not working, or their anxiety is because their blood sugar is too low. So really keep in mind that the two systems are pretty intertwined. So when we look at circadian rhythms, you can see people who are maybe depressed at night, or have anxiety at night, or wake up with anxiety, or have anxiety at 2:00. It's because their circadian rhythm is off. So therefore it's impacting how their brain is functioning throughout the day. So just kind of just more and more symptoms to give you all. So kind of your clinical implications that we've been talking about is, you can see things like, diabetes, hypoglycemia, insomnia, and then mental health. And so I wanted to throw that mental health in there because I did not want to forget to talk about it, which I've done successfully now, I guess. But, I think mental health is a big piece, right? Like, you see a ton of anxiety, but how much of that could be blood sugar? I've had counselors in my office that actually worked inside my office. And, that was some of the things that we often talked about, is patients would have anxiety and we'd say, well, I don't think it's a brain issue. I think it's actually more of a blood sugar issue. As soon as I get that stable, then tell me what you find. And a lot of times the counselors would even say, you know what, because you're able to stabilize the blood sugar, I was actually able to go deeper into some of the issues that they had because I wasn't fighting the blood sugar imbalances. So since their physiology was normalized, now I can go into like what's causing, their stress or their anxiety or their depression or their PTSD. And I thought that was a really great thing to talk about, is how much deeper they could go into their clients' issues and not fighting blood sugar imbalances. So in conclusion, so I think they all come together. The circadian rhythm and blood sugar systems, they tend to kind of ride with each other. So if you tend to see one go up, the other one goes up. And if one goes down, the other one will go down. And it's really important to make sure your blood sugar is stable. Ways of doing that, I would suggest, is you got to get good protein, you got to get healthy fibers and healthy fats. Those are probably the biggest things I can, say, let's try, because that's easy. You have to go buy food. So buy food that would be more along those lines. So quality fiber, protein, and good fats. So they could be like apple and almond butter. It could be, eggs with veggies and avocado. It could be a salad with olive oil and chicken, and maybe maybe a sweet potato as your carb. But let's make sure that we're kind of like doing things to stabilize, because if we stabilize our blood sugar, then we don't need our stress system or adrenal system to get involved. It can kind of ride with you. So that's the biggest thing that I see in my practice, that we're constantly like working on, talking about, revamping, almost on a daily basis. So blood sugar and adrenals run together. And then your cortisol and your melatonin are usually opposite. So again, if somebody has to take melatonin, that might be a question of, is their cortisol or circadian rhythm too high in the evening? And I think if you want to test these things, it's really easy to test glucose on blood work. You just do a fasting. You can look at fasting glucose. You can look at A1C. There's a couple other markers like triglycerides that also give you a clue into blood sugar. And then on the circadian rhythm, I think one of the best tests is actually to do a saliva test and to map out your cortisol throughout the day. You can do this through LabCorp. Actually has this. They actually have a saliva test, but you have to find out which facility has it. There's other third-party tests like Diagnostics. There's Labrix. There's different labs that actually have these cortisol saliva tests, and those are really good to look at their circadian rhythm, because you could be fighting a bunch of things when it comes to insomnia and energy, but it could be a circadian rhythm issue. There are supplements that do support the circadian rhythm. For instance, like phosphatidylserine is one that is pretty well known. A lot of times we'll use that to help kind of revamp the circadian rhythm. You can use adaptogenic herbs like ashwagandha, rhodiola, holy basil leaf. Those are adaptogenic herbs, and they help to kind of normalize the rhythm, where we'll use phosphatidylserine to try to like correct it and see if we can change it along with their diet. And then you have things like licorice that might bring up that circadian rhythm if it's too flat. So those are some of the herbals and things that are out there that are worth trying. And then I think when it comes to food, the first thing to do is just change what you put in your mouth. That's sometimes the easiest place to start. And maybe not the easiest, but that's probably one of the best places to start. And then from there, there are always herbals, and there's things like, Gymney sylvestre, which is good for like people with high blood sugar. And there's, trying to think, there's cinnamon, which can help with like insulin receptor sensitivities. And so there are herbals on all of those planes that are good to use, they should be more of a temporary support, so you're not on them forever and ever and ever. But figure this out, because I think the sooner you work on this, you can kind of say yes or no. Like if this is your answer, then that's super awesome. And if no, then what else can be done, and who else can you find to help you kind of along this journey? So that kind of leads us. So we always do free consultations. So if you guys are interested, or if you have a friend that's interested, or a friend that needs help, families, you name it, we're always here to help. We do free consultations. And during that consultation, we're always looking to say, like, can we help you? And if so, then kind of what's our next step? So do we want to run blood work? Do we want to look at a saliva panel? Do we want to look at other things? And so we always help people answer the question, like, can you help me, and how much will it cost? That's always kind of the two questions. So free consultation is a great way to get started. So we put our phone number there. We would love to help you. We have an awesome nutritionist. We have a nurse practitioner. We have rehab therapists, doctors. So we have a lot of tools to try to help our patients, whether it ranges from blood sugar to concussions to vertigo. So we're happy to help. You can just give us a buzz. And I think that might be it for the evening. So thank you everyone who showed up. We will definitely have this recorded so you can go back and listen. And I hope you all do well. Let us know if we can help you, and hope the rest of your week goes well. Talk to you soon.